October 2008 in Docklands smelled of rotten water, rusty metal, and despair. This ghost town on the outskirts of the city was its forgotten lung, turned inside out and ravaged by gangrene. Abandoned dockside warehouses stood like tombstones to a bygone industrial might, their broken windows staring out at the world with blind eyes. The air was thick with moisture rising from the river and the acrid smoke from fires lit in barrels by the homeless. Patrol Car 47 Bravo crawled slowly over the broken cobblestones, its tires softly splashing through puddles from the recent rain. Officer Jackson, a man with a face carved from stone and a perpetual chewing gum, sat behind the wheel. In the passenger seat sat his partner, Officer Danny Carter. At 32, Danny still retained the sparkle in his eyes that had faded in most of his colleagues within the first 5 years of their service in the Docklands. He viewed the streets not as enemy territory, but as a place to be defended, even if it didn't want him to defend it. Another royal evening in the capital of the world, Jackson joked darkly, circling an overturned trash can. Quieter means more sleep, Danny countered, his gaze sliding along the dark openings between the buildings, searching for movement in the shadows. He was obsessed with detail. His notebook, which he always carried with him, contained not only crime reports, but also sketches and notes, names of local merchants, shift schedules for security guards at factories still in operation, the routes of stray dogs. He believed that to understand a crime, you had to understand a place, and the Docklands was a place he'd been trying to understand for 3 years. The radio came to life, breaking their silence. All units in the Docklands area have received reports of suspicious activity at the abandoned warehouse number 7, corner of Prichelnaya and Rybetskaya streets. Unauthorized entry is possible. Jackson snorted. Homeless people or teenagers again. Let's go check in. They pulled up to warehouse number 7 about 5 minutes later. The massive red brick building, its roof crumbling, stood in the deep shadow cast by a single street lamp on the corner. Not a soul, not a sound except the drips of water from a rusty gutter. "It's okay," Jackson said, turning off the engine. "I'll drive around and see if anyone's hanging around." "I'll check the entrance," Danny said, already opening the door. "Something's not right here." Jackson looked at him with slight irritation. "Carter, there's always something wrong here. This is the Docklands." But Danny was already out. He approached the huge, once-sliding doors of the warehouse. One of them was slightly open, leaving a gap, black as a chasm in space. He pulled out a flashlight and shone the beam inside. Dust dancing in the light, piles of incomprehensible junk, and silence. Deep, oppressive. And then his gaze fell on the ground. Right by the threshold, in the mud, lay a cigarette butt. Not old, not soggy from the rain, almost fresh. An expensive brand, unaffordable for homeless people or teenagers. Meanwhile, Jackson slowly circled the building, his headlights gliding along the brick walls. Nothing, no cars, no people. He returned to the parking lot. Danny was still nowhere to be seen. "Bravo 47 calling Carter," he said into the radio, just hissing. "Carter, do you come in?" A minute passed in silence. Jackson got out of the car, feeling a growing sense of unease. "Danny!" he shouted into the night, his voice swallowed by the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Docklands. He went to the crack in the door and took out his service pistol. "Danny, are you kidding me? Come out!" He stepped inside, illuminating the space with his flashlight. The warehouse was enormous, his footsteps echoing. The beam of light picked out empty pallets, scraps of plastic, broken glass from the darkness. Nothing, no one. Jackson's heart began to pound. He returned to the car and called for backup. "Bravo 47, code 6. The officer isn't responding. Last seen at warehouse number 7. Within 10 minutes, the area was filled with sirens and flashing lights. They searched everywhere, inside the warehouse, on the roof, in neighboring buildings, in the canals. They lowered divers into the murky waters near the dock. They used dogs. The scent they picked up at the door vanished into the parking lot, as if Danny Carter had vanished into thin air. His service weapon, spare magazines, and body armor, everything was left in the patrol car. He got out to inspect the storage area and disappeared. The only clue was that cigarette butt, which would later disappear without a trace in the crime lab. and the words of his partner, who said Danny had been acting strange and obsessive in recent days and hinted at a big case he was involved in. The investigation began that same night, but for the Docklands, it was just another evening. It swallowed Officer Daniel Carter, leaving not a breath of air on the surface. The silence that followed the sirens spoke louder than words. The Docklands held its secrets, and it seemed it had just swallowed one of those who tried to unravel them. The following weeks became a time of painful, hopeless agony for the Carter family. Hope, bright and hysterical in the first 48 hours, slowly melted like ice under acid rain. Every call to the home phone made Evelyn's mother's heart skip a beat, waiting for a miracle that never came. A corpse would have been a miracle, at least a body that could be buried, mourned, and released. The official investigation, led by Detective Rollins, a man with the face of an accountant and the soul of a bureaucrat, followed a well-worn, unpromising path from the very beginning. Theory 1. Desertion. Danny Carter was a model officer with no debts, a clean record, and a family that adored him. But the system always suspected those who disappeared without a trace. They checked his accounts, no suspicious transfers or withdrawals. His passport was at home. The theory crumbled against the reality of everyday life, but its shadow hung in the records like the smell of a corpse. Theory 2. Assault. Revenge by the criminal elements of the Docklands. But who? Danny was strict but fair. He had no sworn enemies. Not a single informant, not a single eared one, provided a single lead. The residents of the Docklands, usually chatty about the cops, this time closed themselves off in a deaf, unanimous silence. They looked at the detectives with blank eyes and shook their heads. They saw nothing, heard nothing, as if Danny didn't exist at all. Theory 3. An accident. Fell into the water, but divers combed the bottom near the pier, got lost, and fell into some maintenance well. But all the wells had been checked. The body simply couldn't have vanished without a trace. And then came the fourth theory, unofficial but persistently heard in the department's smoking rooms and the precinct's corridors. Criminal connections. They said Carter wasn't as clean as he seemed. Perhaps he owed something. Perhaps he saw his chance and fled, faking his disappearance. They whispered he might have been involved in something dirty, and that something had caught up with him. Liam, Danny's younger brother, was 17 at the time. He was witnessing how the system to which his brother had dedicated his life was beginning to devour his memory. During one of his visits to their home, Detective Rollins, with an impassive face, asked Evelyn, "Tell me, Mrs. Carter, has Daniel been acting strange lately? Has he mentioned any financial difficulties? Perhaps he's been having problems in his personal life." Evelyn looked at him with such shock and pain that Liam was ready to throw his fists at the detective. His father, usually reserved, led Rollins out the door, his quiet voice trembling with rage, audible even in the kitchen. "My son was a hero to this city, and you're turning him into dirt." But the most terrifying thing was happening inside the department. Liam, coming to the station, hoping for news, felt the eyes on him. Not sympathetic, but wary, assessing. Danny's colleagues, those with whom he shared rations and risks, suddenly became taciturn. Jackson, his partner, gave a textbook statement. "We split up for inspection. I never saw him again." His eyes were empty and slippery, like those of a freshwater fish. Captain Ryder, the station commander, chastised Liam for interfering with the investigation when he tried to ask the patrolman a few questions on his own. "We're doing the best we can, son. Don't interfere with our work." But the work, it seemed, consisted of neatly filing papers into a thick folder and downgrading the case. After 4 months, the active phase of the investigation was closed. A year later, Daniel Carter's case was relegated to the cold category and filed away, officially due to a lack of leads, unofficially because it had become too inconvenient. It pointed the finger at the rot within the department itself, at that dirty wall of silence and mutual responsibility that Danny might have been trying to breach, and which ultimately consumed him. The Carter house fell silent. The laughter was gone. Evelyn had aged 20 years in 2. His father had retreated into work, trying to numb the pain. And Liam, in him, that pain had transformed into something else, a cold, hard lump of determination. He looked at the photograph of Danny in his police uniform, smiling, confident in his own rightness, and swore an oath. He would become a cop. He would go where his brother couldn't. He would find the truth. And if it meant tearing down that dirty wall, brick by brick, he would do it. 15 years is long enough to erase memories. The Docklands of 2023 was no longer the rotting scar Liam remembered. The Docklands Regeneration Program had transformed it into a gigantic construction site. Somewhere there, beneath a layer of fresh asphalt and concrete slabs, lay the ghosts of his brother and his own teenage grief. Liam Carter, now a detective in internal affairs, rarely visited these parts. His war against the department's dirty wall was waged from a clean, air-conditioned office in the city center, with protocols and memos. His career was a quiet, methodical vengeance. He didn't become a hound like Danny. He became an accountant, searching for discrepancies in the reports. A surgeon lanced the abscesses of corruption with the scalpel of bureaucracy. He never forgot for a day what it all was for. The portrait of Danny on his desk wasn't just a photograph. It was a landmark. On the morning of October 12th, 2023, he was reviewing the latest reports when his personal, unregistered phone vibrated briefly. It was a message from an old acquaintance, a construction worker in Docklands, a man he'd once helped and who knew of his personal mission. The text was terse. Liam, found something at the Warehouse 7 demolition site. Looks like yours. The blood drained from his face, leaving a feeling of icy emptiness. Warehouse number 7, corner of Pricholnaya and Rybatskaya. He cancelled all his meetings and was there 20 minutes later. The scene was surreal. Where the grim brick monstrosity had once stood, a gaping hole yawned. Bulldozers and excavators, like prehistoric insects, growled as they tore apart the remains of the foundation. The air was thick with dust and exhaust fumes. His acquaintance, Benny, in an orange hard hat and dusty vest, waved at him, pointing to the area where the main gate had once stood. They opened up a false wall in the utility room. Benny shouted over the roar of the machinery. There was a niche there, like a hiding place. He handed Liam a small plastic bag. Through the clear plastic, Liam saw something that took his breath away. A token. A police badge. The metal was coated in a thick layer of red rust, the number almost visible through it. His brain, trained over years on details, automatically counted the numbers. It was Danny's. But that wasn't the worst part. His fingers, as if of their own accord, turned the bag over. On the front of the badge, in the recesses of the engraving, in the very places where the letters of the name and department should have been, dark, almost black, lumpy deposits had frozen. They had absorbed dust and rust, but their texture and color were different. It wasn't dirt, it was blood. Dried, blackened by time, but blood nonetheless. It was 15 years old. Benny placed a second bag next to him. Inside was a revolver, an old, reliable model, the kind Danny carried. The cylinder was flipped open. 5 rounds, 1 empty shell. Liam, not being a ballistics expert, immediately noticed the discrepancy. The shell wasn't from the department's standard ammunition. He stood there, unable to move, clutching the packet containing his badge. The rumble of construction faded into a dull hum. Images swam before his eyes. Danny laughing at breakfast. Danny putting on his uniform on graduation day. And Danny disappearing into the black crack of a warehouse. And now, a decade and a half later, Docklands, dying, spat out this piece of evidence, a rusty echo of that evening. The badge was cold and incredibly heavy in his hand. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was pain made real, proof that his brother hadn't run away, hadn't abandoned them. The worst had happened to him. He'd been murdered, and someone had hidden the body and this evidence in the wall, knowing that one day the warehouse would be torn down and the truth would perhaps be buried under tons of concrete. But they were wrong. The truth had found its way out. It lay in his hand, covered in rust and his brother's dried blood. The cold rage Liam had nurtured all these years suddenly focused, became sharp as a blade. He slowly looked up at the workers scurrying around, at the scurrying machinery. No one suspected that a grave had just been opened. Not the one containing a body, but the one in which the truth was buried. He nodded to Benny, stuffed the bags into his inside jacket pocket, and walked to his car without looking back. His world had just been turned upside down. The official cold case had become scorching hot again, and this time he was the investigator, and he wasn't about to play by the rules. Liam's office in Internal Affairs was as sterile and impersonal as an operating room. No extra papers, no personal belongings, save for that very photo of Danny. Now, on his metal desk, lay 2 evidence bags, like artifacts from another era, which they were. He acted quickly and quietly, as he had been trained. The badge and revolver were sent not to the department's official crime lab, but to a private investigator, an old acquaintance who knew how to keep secrets and whose loyalty had been tested over the years. The wait was torture. Every hour, Liam expected the door to his office to swing open and for people from Jackson's department to enter with a search warrant. The results came back 48 hours later. They were as clear as a knife wound. Report number 1. Biological analysis. The brown stains on the badge are human blood. The DNA is 99.8% consistent with Daniel Carter's reference sample taken from his personal file. Report number 2. Ballistics. The empty shell in the revolver is a .38 caliber, but it's not the department's standard ammunition. It's a Winchester .38 Special, popular among civilians and, as the expert noted, with barely perceptible irony, among some officers as a spare unofficial ammo. The gun hadn't fired a shot for at least 10 years before being stashed. It left no fingerprints. Liam leaned back in his chair. Now he had irrefutable proof. Danny was dead, and he'd been killed with a weapon that wasn't listed in the department's records. This wasn't a street criminal. This was someone who wanted the shot to be untraceable to their service weapon, a professional. He opened the department's database. He had access to the cold case archives. He started from the very beginning, but now his perspective was different. He was looking not for evidence against mythical bandits, but for anomalies within the system. And he found them. Lots of them. First, a partner, Officer Marcus Jackson. A year after Danny's disappearance, he was transferred from patrol to special operations, an elite, secretive unit tasked with combating drug trafficking in the Docklands, a rapid career advancement for a man who had survived tragedy. Second, Special Operations. This unit was legendary, officially for its successes, unofficially for its secretive nature and operating methods that bordered on the illegal. They were the shadow of the Docklands. They didn't report to the district station. Their reports were extremely terse, and the number of drugs confiscated and arrests was off the charts. And all this with virtually no casualties. Thirdly, strange coincidences. Liam came across several old reports of shootouts involving special operations. 2 of them mentioned unidentified perpetrators who fled the scene. One of the reports, in tiny handwriting, read, "According to a witness, one of the attackers resembled Officer Jackson." The entry was marked unconfirmed and conveniently forgotten. Liam felt a shiver run down his spine. He remembered Danny's last words to their father. "I found something big." Danny, with his meticulous nature, couldn't help but notice what was happening in his neighborhood. He should have realized that special operations successes were too perfect. He began his own small private investigation, and he found his own colleagues. Jackson wasn't just a partner. He was an enemy, a member of a corrupt group Danny was trying to expose. And that night at Warehouse 7, they arranged a meeting for him. Not with random thugs, but with people he trusted to watch his back. They knew he suspected nothing. They lured him in, killed him, staged his disappearance, and hid his body and the evidence in a wall that would be torn down 15 years later. Liam stood and walked to the window. The city shone below, clean and indifferent. The blue wall, the Brotherhood of Cops, was rotten from the inside. His brother had fallen victim not to the streets, but to the system he had sworn to protect. And now he, Liam, sat at the very heart of that system, holding the evidence of its betrayal. He turned and looked at the badge again. Rust and blood. This wasn't just evidence, it was a challenge to him, to his department, and to all the lies he'd been living on for all these years. The war had just moved from the quiet office into the open, and his opponents weren't abstract bad guys, but his own colleagues, people in uniforms just like his and his brothers. The badge and revolver lay in Liam's safe, cold, and silent, like an indictment. They proved the murder, but they named no names. They were the end of the story, not its beginning. Liam needed a route, a plan that led Danny to his death. He needed motives and names. He spent the next few days sifting through the digital jungle of archives. He searched for anything related to Danny during his final months on the force. Financial records, incident reports, even the camera footage from his patrol car. Everything was clean. Too clean. His brother's official biography was as immaculate as a polished uniform. And then he remembered. As a child, Danny had a habit of hiding his most treasured secrets, not in his room, but in an old, abandoned birdhouse in the backyard. The best hiding place is one that's in plain sight, but no one wants, he'd say. Could this childhood habit still persist? Liam drove to the train station, a vast, bustling hub that was a city within a city. He walked to the rows of old storage lockers, the same ones that had been in operation since the last century, with mechanical key locks. He started with the lockers whose numbers held significance for him and his brother. Danny's birth date, the license plate number of his first patrol car, the day he graduated from the academy. On the third day, when despair was already beginning to set in, the key with the number 12-5, their mother's birthday, turned in the lock of cell 347 with a dull, triumphant click. The door swung open. Inside was a small cardboard box. No dust, no cobwebs. Someone had been renting this storage unit for years, paying their rent regularly. Liam took the box to his car, locked himself inside, and opened it. There was no diary in the traditional sense. It was a simple, tattered notebook in a cardboard cover. But when Liam opened it, he was overcome with a cold dread. The pages were covered with columns of numbers, dates, strange abbreviations, and symbols. It was a code. Danny, always meticulous, kept not personal notes, but a task log. He encrypted everything. Liam spent the entire night trying to crack the code. He tried everything, shifting letters, replacing numbers with letters, using codes from their childhood games. Nothing worked. Desperate, he simply flipped through the pages, peering into the digital stream. His gaze fell on the last, partially filled page. Among the columns of numbers, ordinary words were written there, as if Danny had been in a hurry and hadn't had time to encode them. "I'm too big a stake. Jackson is involved. Knows I know everything. Hand over at Pier 9. Meeting at the warehouse tonight. Final bet." Liam's heart pounded. He turned the page. On the back, at the very bottom, was a final, desperate note written in a nervous, hurried hand. "If something happens, if I'm not here, look for the witness girl, nicknamed Night Butterfly. She saw everything that night at Pier 9. She's the key. She's afraid, but she's honest. Find her. Deet." Night Butterfly, a witness. Liam leaned back in his seat, feeling cold sweat trickle down his face. Danny had a witness, someone who had seen something important at Pier 9 that very night, perhaps the very transmission he'd written about. Danny was on the trail of corrupt cops playing their dirty game, and he had a witness, and he went to meet his killers, perhaps hoping for irrefutable evidence, not even suspecting it was a trap. The notebook was a map leading to his brother's death. Night Butterfly was the only living person on that map, the only one who could connect Jackson and his special operations accomplices to the murder. Liam looked at the encrypted pages again. Now they didn't seem like a meaningless jumble of symbols. It was his brother's voice, coming from behind a 15-year wall of silence. It was his last, undeciphered cry for help, and Liam swore he would find Nightmoth. He would decipher this notebook. He would follow Danny's route to the very end. And this time, if necessary, a bullet would be fired not into the back of an innocent man, but point blank at those who had exchanged their oath for dirty money. Night Butterfly, the name burned into Liam's consciousness like a brand. It was his only thread leading from the labyrinth of lies straight into the heart of darkness. But finding the ghost, whose existence was merely a line in a 15-year-old note, turned out to be the most difficult operation of his career. He couldn't use official channels. Any database query, any question to the veteran drug enforcement officers would instantly raise alarm bells among Jackson and his accomplices. Liam acted like a shadow. He descended into the very same filth his brother once patrolled. He visited old, forgotten addresses. He consorted with the dregs of society, former dealers, pimps, and thieves who remembered the Docklands before its rebirth. He spent his own money on information, lurking in stinking basements and abandoned attics, risking recognition. He was a ghost, hunting another ghost. His persistence and his brother's name, which still commanded a vague respect in some circles, paid off. After a week of desperate searching, he found a clue. An elderly woman, who had once run a flophouse for prostitutes, whispered, averting her eyes, "Butterfly. Alice Gray. She's sober. They say she's cured, moved away, lives somewhere on the outskirts, works as a seamstress. Not the same girl anymore, man. Leave her alone." But Liam couldn't. He found her through social services records, a modest apartment in a faceless panel tower block on the other side of the town. When he knocked on the door, his heart pounded as if it wanted to burst out of his chest. A woman of about 40 opened the door, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. Her face was haggard but pure. Her posture suggested she was ready to slam the door and disappear at any moment. "Miss Gray?" Liam said quietly, showing his ID, not a police one, but his old student ID. "My name is Liam Carter. I'm Danny's brother." The name struck her like an electric shock. She turned pale and recoiled. "Go away," she whispered. "Please go away. I don't know anything." "He wrote about you before he died," Liam persisted, putting his foot in the doorway. "He said you were honest, that you saw everything. He needed your help then. He needs it now. I need your help." He saw the struggle in her eyes. Old, animal fear against a tired but living conscience. Finally, she nodded silently and let him in. The tiny but clean living room smelled of tea and old paper. Alice sat clutching a mug, her fingers white with tension. "I was afraid you'd come. I've been afraid all these years," she began, looking out the window. "They'll kill me if they find out." "They? You mean Jackson and the others from Special Ops?" Liam asked. She nodded, swallowing. I was working on the dock back then. I saw them unloading crates, not ordinary ones, without identifying marks. And then big men in civilian clothes would come, take them, and pay in cash. I thought they were drugs. But one day I went closer and saw one of the crates fall and break. A weapon fell out, new, covered in grease. Liam froze. This was more than drug trafficking. This was arms trafficking. That night, the night your brother went missing, I saw him. He arrived alone, in his patrol car. He hid behind some containers and watched. He filmed everything with a little camera. Then they arrived, Jackson and 2 others, not in a squad car, but in some old beat-up car. They started loading those very same boxes. And then Danny, your brother, came out. He had this look on his face, such disappointment. He said, "Marcus, what are you doing?" She closed her eyes, as if trying to erase the image. Jackson was taken aback at first, then he laughed. He said, "You're too nosy, Danny." And then one of those others pulled out a gun. Not like the cops, a small one. Danny tried to grab his, but Jackson was faster. He hit him on the head. Your brother fell. And that other one, he leaned over and fired, point blank. An oppressive silence fell over the room. Liam felt every cell in his body fill with icy rage. They loaded him, his body, into the trunk of their car. Alice's voice trembled. And they loaded the boxes into another. And they drove away. And I stood around the corner, frozen with fear. I was afraid they'd find me too. Your brother was a good man. He didn't detain me one time. He took me to the cafeteria, fed me, talked to me. He was a good man. She burst into tears. Quiet, bitter tears that had been building up inside her for 15 years. Liam sat, stunned. He had everything now. The killer's name, Jackson. The motive, exposing an arms trafficking scheme. And a witness who had seen everything. But a witness who was ready to disappear at any moment. He thanked Alice, left her his number, and walked out, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. The truth was uglier than he could have imagined. His brother hadn't died in a shootout with bandits. He'd been executed in cold blood by his own people as an obstacle to their dirty business. And the blue wall remained silent because it was part of that machine. Now Liam had a witness, and the final, most dangerous part of the journey was to force the system to condemn itself. The office of the department head, Robert Hayes, was just as Liam had imagined it all these years. Polished oak, leather chairs, portraits of predecessors on the walls, embodying an unbroken line of power and tradition. The air was thick and still, smelling of expensive tobacco and old money. Liam stood at attention, feeling the icy weight of Danny's badge in his pocket burning into the fabric. A file lay before Hayes. Not a thick folder of archival material, but a slim, pithy collection of facts Liam had been compiling for the past few weeks. Alice Gray's testimony, recorded on a dictaphone and signed with her shaky signature. Photographs of the badge and revolver. The independent expert's conclusions. Transcribed fragments from Danny's notebook, where references to transfer, Jackson, and jackpot were clearly discernible. Hayes, a man with grey temples and a face carved from granite, finished reading the last page, took off his glasses, and slowly wiped them with a silk handkerchief. These are very serious charges, Detective Carter. His voice was even, without a single note of emotion. Against a hero of our department, against a respected officer. Against my brother's killer, sir, Liam retorted, quietly but clearly, and against a corrupt group that has been trafficking weapons for 15 years, behind our own shields. Hayes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The testimony of a single woman with a dark past. Evidence discovered in violation of every conceivable procedure. Recordings that can be interpreted in two ways. The court will tear it all to shreds in half an hour. She saw them kill him, sir. Liam's voice cracked, breaking through the icy control. Point blank, they loaded his body into the trunk. Jackson was his partner. Officer Jackson has a spotless record and 12 commendations, Hayes snapped coldly. It's his word against that of a drug-addicted prostitute. Whose word do you think the court will accept? Liam understood. He wasn't looking at his ally. He was looking at the wall, the most important wall, the wall that protected the system from itself. So what? Liam asked, his voice flat again. We just forget? Again? Hayes sighed heavily, something vaguely resembling regret flickering in his eyes. No, we won't forget. We'll do what this institution must do to survive. Officer Jackson and 2 other special operations officers will be dismissed under the circumstances for violating the code of honor, for associating with suspicious characters. The arms trafficking case will be investigated, unofficially. What about the murder? Liam whispered. What about my brother's body? The body will never be found. Hayes's gaze became unreadable. And a murder charge without a body, you know how that ends. An acquittal and a scandal that will ruin the department's reputation for generations to come. Sometimes, Detective, the truth isn't enough. Sometimes you need stability. Liam stood, clenching his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He'd won the battle, but lost the war. He'd achieved truth, but there would be no justice. The system had sacrificed a few pawns to preserve the king. Jackson and his henchmen would avoid prison. They'd simply lose their jobs and fade into the shadows. And Danny would remain in some nameless pit where he'd been dumped 15 years ago. He left the office without another word. A week later, scant press releases were issued announcing the dismissal of 3 officers for professional misconduct. No details, no names other than official ones. For the press, it was more news about a purge. For Liam, it was a bitter, cynical, Pyrrhic victory. That same evening, he arrived at that same Pier 9. The docklands around him had changed, but the water by the pier still smelled of mud and fuel oil. He pulled Danny's badge from his pocket. Rust and dried blood merged into a single, ugly hole. He squeezed it in his palm, feeling the cold metal. The truth didn't free him. It only shackled him to an even heavier chain, the chain of consciousness. He looked at the murky, dark water where his brother's bones might still lie and understood that the code of silence had not been broken. His brother had fallen victim not to people, but to the system. A system that devours its best to preserve its rotten core. He hadn't been able to get justice for Danny, but he vowed that not a single officer in this city would die at the hands of his own. His war wasn't over. It had only just begun. And now he knew his enemy wasn't a man, but silence. And he would fight it to the end, even if that end was as bleak and lonely as the water at this dock.